Hi, this is Becky Nunn with Nunn Design, and I'm on location at Fusion Beads. In this video, I want to show you how you can use colorized resin and organics to create fabulous pendants like you're seeing here. What you'll need for this technique is to have watched a video on how to mix the Nunn Design Resin, how to colorize the resin. We used an opaque pigment, a red, a brown, and a white to create this dogwood color. You'll need some open back bezels and some bezels and some organics. I have a couple of stir sticks and some toothpicks and some tweezers and some business cards. The first part of this is you're going to be using your colorants and pouring it inside of the bezels. I tend to like to take my stir sticks and break them in half so that I can use multiple, with multiple pours, the same little stir sticks. This we've already mixed up and it's kind of getting thick, but it's still plenty liquid enough for us to use in this project. I've already prepped my open back bezel and I have a little bit of packing tape on the back part of it, as you can see here, and I've burnished that tape down. And I like to put my pieces on little business cards because this allows me to move my pieces around without disturbing the resin or touching the resin and getting it onto my hands. So I'll start with this right here, the open back bezel. You'll want to just use your stir stick and you just drizzle a small amount into the base. As you can see, this is kind of getting thick, but I think it's going to be fine for what we're working on here. You just place it into the base of the bezel. It's always best to take your time and go slow and under pour versus pouring too much in and having to clean it up. So I'm pouring just enough into the base, wiping off my sides of the stir stick. I tend to like to always place it into another cup and not onto my work surface so I can keep my work surface nice and clean. The next step in this is I'm going to use my toothpick to move this resin around into all of these side crevices, because I have found that I often get air bubbles right on the edges of this, when we turn it over to the other side, because this is going to be double-sided. I tend to have air bubbles that get stuck down into the crevices there. So I'm going to use my toothpick to move that resin around into those corner areas. Going all along the sides. And this agitation will help release those bubbles and bring them to the surface. The longer that you wait with your resin, the thicker it gets, the harder it is for the resin to off-gas and for those bubbles to move to the surface. So you want to make sure that you have spent plenty of time making sure that those bubbles are released. I'm not going to fill it that much more full because I'm going to be putting my organics in there and putting a second layer over the top. If I had gotten any of the resin on the side, I could use a toothpick or a Q-tip to go around and clean up that resin. And if you do over pour, don't worry about it. I'll show you some tips on how you can clean that up later. These other bezels that I have ready to go, I've cleaned them already with some rubbing alcohol, and I'm ready to pour my colorant into them as well. So now you can see how you can use an open back bezel as well as a solid back bezel. The same technique applies for making sure that you don't have a lot of bubbles trapped up into that area. So I'm using my toothpick to gently bring that resin there and also to release. If you do pour too much resin into your bezel, a tip that you can do, I'm going to bring this up a little bit, is you can use your toothpick to remove some of that resin from the bezel. And why you'd want to do this is, I'll show you, when you put that organics on later, if your height is too great, it gives the organics an opportunity to pop out of the surface, and it's harder to cover it up with that second pour of resin we're going to go over the top with. So now you have an idea of what you do. If you have too much resin in there and you've overfilled it, you can remove it, and then you'll go ahead and fill the third one. Then you'll want to let this set for, you have, let's see this, you can work anywhere from 6 to 12 hours when it's a soft cure, and you'll be ready in 6 to 12 hours to do your second part. After 6 to 12 hours, the resin will be set up enough for us to do this next step of laying on the organics on top of the colorized resin, and also for us to take this tape off the back side. I'm going to do this now. You could wait until the end, but I want to show you how to remove the tape and clean up the back side so that the back is nice. Earlier I had mentioned that I often get little air bubbles trapped. You'll see them right along here if you didn't take time to use that toothpick to go in and agitate this and remove it. It's happened a lot of times, so trust me, if you have them, it's because the resin has trapped the air inside of there. So for removing the tape off the back, this really does need to be cured, about 12 hours to remove this. These you can work in 6 hours, but for this particular piece, if you remove this tape too early, it'll still be slightly tacky and you could damage the resin. So you'll pull the tape off of the back, like I'm doing here. And you see how that's a nice smooth surface? That was because we did not have any marbling in this tape. If you had marbling on the tape, it will show up on this back surface. So once your piece has cured and you have removed the tape, you might have a little bit of extra residue of stickiness on the back side of this. I do on this particular piece. I have found that Goo Gone, you can see that this bottle has been around for a really long time. This works great for removing that extra sticky. So you can follow the manufacturer's instructions, and I believe it says you just put a couple of drops onto the back and you let it set for about a minute, and it will activate, and it just completely removes the stickiness off of the back of this piece. Any of you moms out there who have kids that like to put stickers all over the car when they're driving around in the car seat, this is a nice little tip for that too. So your Goo Gone will have multiple purposes. Once it has sat for about a minute, you're going to go ahead and just scrape. I had very little residue on here. Some pieces you'll have more probably than others, but it will just scrape right off of the back. So I'm using my stir stick that's in my kit. And then with a wet wipe, I'm just going to wipe that Goo Gone off. And then I have a Q-tip with some rubbing alcohol that I'll just rub over the base of this to kind of just make it nice and clean. You can also wash this down with soap and water, the resin piece, but I found that the rubbing alcohol works really well. And now this piece is also ready for us to do this next part of laying down our organics on top of the colorized resin. For this next step, you're going to want to have prepared your organics, and there is a great blog post on the fusionbeads.com blog that talks about how to prepare organics so that they can work and play nicely in resin. You'll also want to have a cup of clear resin mixed, and you might want to watch the Nunn Design How to Mix Resin video that shows you how to do that. So these pieces here have colorized resin in them and they're ready to go. It's been about six hours on these, and 12 is a good amount of time. And we're ready to embed our organics into this base color and pour the resin on top. So this is already hard. This is a good time to make sure that all of your resin and organic pieces are nicely designed. So for example, on this one, I know that I'm going to need to have a pair of scissors to cut away this extra little stem area. Let's see, I'm going to plan on putting this into this right here. And if that was too big, you would trim away the excess. And for a piece like this, I could lay these organics inside of here. Whichever way you want. You need a little pair of scissors to go ahead and trim away that excess. So I'm going to go ahead and trim that away. Double check that that fits nicely inside of there. And trim these. For this part, I have also a pair of tweezers that make it much easier for me to move my organics around with and in the resin. I'm going to remove my organics from my piece and first drizzle in a little bit of the clear Nunn Design Resin into the base using my stir stick. This is resin that we mixed a little bit ago, so it's starting to get thick, but I think we will still be able to use it for this purpose. I'm putting a little bit of the resin down into the base of the piece first. And using my toothpick to stir that around. And give myself a nice base for my organics to drop into. This is starting to get thick, and when it gets thick, it has a lot harder time off-gassing, and therefore the bubbles tend to get trapped inside of there. We're just going to keep on going here and see how this works. Lay your organics right inside of the bezel and use your tweezers to move it down into position. Then I like to poke it down inside of there, and I'm helping the air that could potentially be trapped underneath that to squeeze its way out. See how it's moving out from underneath that resin? Once that I have that all inside of there, I don't know what that is over there, I'm ready to drizzle on more of the resin. It's always best to under pour and add more as you go instead of just putting too much in there. So I'm continuing to drizzle more resin onto the top of this. And the Nunn Design Resin is a self-doming resin, so it'll get right to those side edges and it will stop. But let me show you a trick of what I recommend doing. If you do pour too much and you have some area of your bezel that has resin on it, like this, see how it went over the side? I highly recommend you do two things. One is that you clean this up and get it all consistent. It just provides a much cleaner and consistent professional look. Or intentionally pour more on and pull it to the sides all the way around so it's consistently poured over. You see what I mean? This is starting to set up, so this resin is not as easy to show you this with, but you would drag it over to all of the side edges and then drizzle a little bit more of the resin onto the surface and create a high dome. So you'll continue to do the other two in the same way. If you did pour some resin on and your piece wasn't quite adhered to the base, it will rise up to the surface and it will protrude out the top, as you can see here. It's not a flush, flat surface. You'll want to do a third pour in cases like this so that the resin completely covers your organic and protects it, especially on little seed pods like this because they could easily get crushed. Here's another example of where the resin, you can see the organics are protruding out the surface. So you'll want to put another coat of resin over the top and bring that up to a nice high dome, and therefore it'll protect the organics and give it a nice finished look. Once your pieces have fully cured, another 12 hours, this is all ready to go and you can make them into assembled pieces of jewelry like you're seeing here. This is Becky Nunn with Nunn Design. I'm shooting on location here at Fusion Beads, and I'm showing you how you can embed organics over colorized resin. I hope you've enjoyed it.